Resilience. It's about getting back on your feet much quicker than you would normally do if you did not have those structures in place.
Good morning from Kingston, Jamaica. My name is Galina Sutirova. I'm the country manager for Jamaica for the World Bank. And as you have seen in the video, resilience is the word in the Caribbean. And when we talk resilience, it's fiscal, financial, economic, climate resilience. And Jamaica has been a front runner on all this, in all these areas. So I'm very, very happy to be here this morning with the Minister of Finance and the Public Service, Dr. Nigel Clark. So thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Galina. This is a wonderful idea, the Econathon, and I'm just happy to be able to participate. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much. So Jamaica has done an impressive turnaround. You know, only a few years ago, Jamaica was one of the most indebted countries in the world. What happened? You know, what were the key drivers for Jamaica now to have cut its public debt at the equivalent of half of its GDP?
Well, Galina, first by way of background, due to a banking sector crisis in the 1990s and the failure of large state-owned enterprises, Jamaica racked up a high level of national debt. Right. We would have entered the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, with debt at about 125% of GDP, with interest. And then
it shot up.
Yeah, and with interest accounting for 50% of tax revenues. The global financial crisis compounded what was already an unsustainable and impossible situation. Jamaica sought the assistance of the IMF in 2010 and engaged in a debt exchange, and despite legislative reforms such as the foundation of our fiscal rules and the divestment of loss-making state-owned enterprises, that agreement ended prematurely.
Right.
It's not easy. Not easy at all. By 2013, Jamaica's debt was at 145% of GDP, one of the highest in the world. Our external position was unviable. Our fiscal trajectory was unsustainable. Jamaica had run out of options. In the context of a lot of on cynicism, shall we say, and lack of confidence in Jamaica's commitment to reform and in Jamaica's ability to reform itself, Jamaica brokered an arrangement with the IMF, a $932 million extended fund facility in May of 2013. And that was followed in 2016 by a $1.6 billion precautionary standby arrangement with the IMF. Over the last 6 years, between the EFF and the standby facility, Jamaica has reduced its debt from 145% of GDP to 95% of GDP in March of 2019. This is, as you say, unprecedented. This was done without debt relief, without debt write-off, without bilateral debt support from friends. Firstly, the credit for this turnaround, Galina, belongs wholly and squarely with the Jamaican people.
Absolutely.
The Jamaican people owned the problem, and the Jamaican people owned the reforms that were required to solve this problem. So the first sort of factor of success is ownership. Ownership of the problem and ownership of the reforms required.
Absolutely.
The second factor of success, which was absolutely crucial, is that Jamaica had a pre-existing foundation of social partnership. So the mechanisms to promote multi-stakeholder dialogue existed before we got into this situation. So in addition to ownership of problem and solution, having social sort of partnership that promotes dialogue was important. And the third, building on those two, has been an unprecedented level of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder participation in the reforms. Stakeholders demanded fidelity to the reforms in exchange for the sacrifices that were required. And we had participation from the unions, from the media, from the business community, private sector, the banking community, from and various other civil society groups, academia, and otherwise. So when you put those together, ownership of the problem and the solution, pre-existing social partnership, and unprecedented level of stakeholder involvement, not leaving the problem to the politicians alone, that provided the foundation of the turnaround. Now, in terms of policy, the turnaround would have taken place in the context of continued high primary surpluses over the last 6 years, 7.5% to 7% to 6.5%, and deep structural reforms, tax, monetary, fiscal reforms, public sector reform, and other structural reforms within the context of pursuing a very high primary surplus.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that these are very, very good lessons for everybody for all the countries that can find themselves in similar situations, or even in less dramatic situations. The social support, the broad participation and ownership of the problem is actually key, and it was proven here, and the results are here. The results are here not only in fiscal consolidation, the results are here also in growth.
Correct.
And the good positive trend is likely to continue provided policy reforms continue. So what would it take, to continue?
So just on that, Jamaica's had 17 consecutive quarters of economic growth, which represents the longest stretch of quarterly economic growth since we started measuring growth quarterly in 1996. We also have the lowest unemployment rate in our history. We're in the period of the lowest levels of inflation on a multi-year basis in our history. There's no Jamaican, all Jamaicans want this period of economic opportunity to last long into the future.
Right.
And therefore, there is a momentum to ensure that these gains are preserved. In terms of preserving the gains, we're going to need to continue on the path of fiscal credibility and fiscal responsibility, abiding by our own domestic legislation, our own fiscal rules, which mandate a debt to GDP of no more than 60% by 2025-26. We're going to need to continue to build and strengthen domestic institutions, modernize our central bank. There's legislation in Parliament now to strengthen the central bank, to capitalize it, to make it independent, to introduce greater levels of transparency and accountability, and to clarify its mandate to be focused on the pursuit of low, stable, and predictable inflation. We are also going to have to continue to pursue the various reforms that we are embarked upon, reforms to the public sector, reforms, microeconomic reforms to improve the productivity of capital and the productivity of labor, to continue to lower the cost of doing business in Jamaica. And, we'll have to, and also continue to strengthen the social safety net to ensure that the gains are shared among all Jamaicans.
And yet Jamaica is very vulnerable to climate change, and a big storm can take back, Jamaica years, in macro stability and the growth. So what is Jamaica doing? What is the government doing, to protect?
Yeah, so I would say the fifth that we have to do to preserve this period is to manage the risks that we are subject to. And one of those risks is the risk of natural disaster. And natural disaster is a problem because it can destabilize budgetary revenues. It can destabilize an otherwise sound fiscal trajectory. We want to make sure that in the event of a natural disaster, we have access to non-budgetary funds that can be used to deal with emergency expenditure. And we're pursuing, in a very strategic way, a multi-layered approach, the bottom layer being what we allocate on an annual basis, the second layer being fiscal savings that are in a natural disaster contingency fund, and we made a historic allocation in March of this year, 2 billion Jamaican dollars, for the first time, set aside to be used only in the event of natural disaster, and we intend to build on that over time. We completed a contingent credit claim instrument, with the Inter-American Development Bank, $285 million that allows us to draw down in the event of natural disaster, within days of a natural disaster event. And we have the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and we are building on top of that, with the help of the World Bank, a risk transfer product such as a catastrophe bond.
Thank you very much. I mean, the conversation can continue because it's really fascinating, and what other countries can learn from Jamaica is absolutely valuable, but we have to cut. So thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Galina.
Thanks.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Goodbye from Jamaica.